Let's shift our attention to Egypt for a moment. We've seen there's an impatience for elections there. We take our own example here in South Africa. It was a painstaking process, 2 years of constitution building after release of Nelson Mandela. What are the inherent risks here? I mean, are we likely to create paper-thin democracies?
Well, I just think we should be sensible about the scale of the task. I mean, for countries like mine, it took us hundreds of years to develop democratic systems. You know, people often forget this, but universal suffrage didn't come in until pretty late on in the UK. And actually, the right of women to vote only came in, you know, the early part of the 20th century. So it's important to realize these countries are coming from a state that is anti-democratic to a democratic state in a very quick space of time. The other thing I would really emphasize as well is that a lot of people are out there protesting for democracy, but people are even more protesting, or as much protesting, for jobs, for social justice, for an economy that opens up opportunity to people. And the one thing I would say that we have to be really careful of is not to ignore the economic aspect of this. Because if what happens in these countries is that you get a democratic system, but the economy stagnates, you're going to have a big problem in the future.
Let's move closer home now, Tony. You've always been upbeat about the African continent. Why so, given all its problems?
Well, I am even more upbeat about Africa today. I actually think when I look at the 21st century, you know, obviously the rise of China is clear and demonstrable. India too, the sharing of power between West and East, all of that is obviously true. What is less obviously true, but I believe, is that the 21st century will be Africa's century. I think there is an extraordinary opportunity for Africa right now. And let me tell you why I say that. You can look at all the figures on sort of growth levels and foreign and direct investment and all of that, which is becoming increasingly positive. The number of countries that are democratic today in Africa, changing governments democratically, all the statistics you can compile. The thing that stands out for me about Africa is that I'm noticing the same thing in Africa today that you could have noticed in India 15 to 20 years ago. And that is the emergence of a younger generation of political, business, civic society, social enterprise leaders who are people with self-belief, right? And what is the hallmark of self-belief? You stop thinking that your problem is somebody else's problem, and you actually relish the challenge of sorting your own problems out. And that's what I'm noticing in African countries today. I think it's, you know, my Africa project, which is about governance in Africa, works in about 5 different African countries. The young people that we're working with in government today in these countries, I am really excited by. I think they're fantastic. And yeah, I am massively positive and optimistic about Africa. I know the problems are immense and you can describe them very easily, but I think the 21st century will be Africa's century and should be.
You move on to Rwanda next. What will you be doing there?
So my team work alongside the president and his team there. What we do, you see, my other thing, theory of government, and you know what I do in my new life is work on things where I learned something about particular issues in my old life, right? So I came to the conclusion. I mean, aid, by the way, I think is important, and aid has helped deliver massive reductions in deaths from child mortality to malaria to measles and so on. All of that is true, but I actually think the big challenge for African governments today is what I call the challenge of getting things done, okay? In other words, you can get anyone come in, you know, and I see these reports that African governments have, which as a sort of, and everything's like a 2020 vision or a 2025 vision or a 2030 vision. And they're great reports, but the problem for the governments is actually translating those reports into reality. So what's less hard is to see what they should do. What is very hard to see is how they do it. So we really focus on the how. So we bring in teams of people who work in country alongside the president. I sort of partner and interact with the president of those countries. And so what we do is we prioritize, we focus on delivery, and we try and, basic things, power, infrastructure. If you've got an agricultural program, actually focusing on getting it done. And the biggest single challenge for any government today, but I think particularly so in Africa, is less, as I say, this ideological battle about right and left. It's really about delivery, performance, and getting the job done. And if we concentrate on that, and concentrate not on trying to do everything, when I ever see a report that says we've got 150 priorities here, I know nothing's ever going to happen, because life doesn't work like that. So you take 3 or 4 or 5, you can get them done, and that's what we concentrate on doing, and we love doing it. And it's a great thing. One of the problems of the West right now is, there's lots of problems, but one of the things is we kind of lost a bit of the energy and excitement that goes with, feeling you're on the way up. Now, I personally think we can get that back and should. But what I find really exciting in working in these countries, where the problems are obviously enormous, is there is that energy and excitement there. And I find it, it's an honor and a privilege to work in it. And I remember when I put Africa on the G8 summit at Glen Eagles in 2005, it was considered, a little bit eccentric, but I've never regretted it, and I love the work I do now in Africa.
During your time as PM, you trebled aid to Africa. Looking back, has aid really worked?
Yes, but it's not the answer. So my view is, I don't subscribe to this sort of, the dead aid thesis at all. Look, if you look at malaria and the deaths from malaria coming down, and you can measure this, so let's say the HIV/AIDS situation with access to antiretroviral drugs and so on, you're talking about millions of lives saved. The halving, or more than halving, of deaths from measles and so on. I think aid works particularly in that context, though. Where I think we should be quite self-critical in the West about aid is where we end up, having our little, sort of pet projects in countries which appeal to our own parliaments back home. But, some countries that I work with in Africa have told me that they this happens less now, partly because we're working to reduce this situation. But I remember one finance minister telling me he used to spend 50% of his time negotiating with the donor community. Now, that's us getting in the way, not helping. So I think we can be far smarter about aid. I think it does work, but I think the absolute key to the future is good governance, a focus on anti-corruption, honesty, transparency, accountability, and above all, getting the damn thing done.
For the benefit.
So the Sports Foundation, we work on getting grassroots coaches. So we've now got 800 coaches and officials in the Northeast, which work in some of the most difficult areas. We've got thousands of kids taking part in competitions like tennis and rowing, and we do athletics and soccer and all these things. So that really works on sport. You see, my view is sport. I used to have this huge debate inside my own government the whole time. Because people, whenever you got round to, sorry, I know, have we got time?
No.
Yeah. Whenever you used to get round to talking about sport, people would adopt right, it's the end of the day now, we're relaxing, we're talking about sport. And I used to say to them, no, sport is a mainstream policy of modern government. Sport is, in many ways, the best health policy, the best anti-crime policy, the best social skills policy that you will have. So what I wanted to do, we put a lot of investment into sport whilst I was Prime Minister. I wanted to create a sports foundation that encouraged that grassroots sport and participation in it. For the Faith Foundation, well, I describe why that's so necessary, because of this view I have that as globalization pushes the world together, we have to be careful that culture and religion doesn't pull it back apart. And on Africa, look, this is just a long-standing commitment. So I spent a lot of time on that, on the Middle East. And, you know, I don't think I will ever retire, because I'm a believer in, someone once said to me, retire, then expire. So I'm going to postpone that day. But the only thing that slightly alarms me about my new life is how much I didn't know in my old life. If there's any sort of wisdom would be too elevated a word to use, but if there's anything I can impart to the modern leaders now, it's just to understand the extraordinary interconnectedness of the world today. I think that is its defining characteristic, and it's why old methods of politics and government don't really work.
Now, despite all your commitments, you're very passionate about beyond sport. Why is it so important for you?
Well, I'm passionate about sport, partly because sport for me has meant a lifetime of underachievement and frustration. You know, there's occasions, I mean, it's a bit like, you know, when my other great thing I wanted to be when I was young was a rock star. And one huge benefit of growing up in an era without the social media is that fortunately there is no YouTube or videoed recording of my band. Because if there was no way I'd be sitting here today. Such would be the level of embarrassment. In fact, my kids are, unfortunately, there is one picture of me as a long-haired rock singer, and every time, when my kids were teenagers and they would occasionally disgrace themselves, it was impossible ever to exert any parental discipline, because this photograph would be produced, and they would say, however badly we have behaved, we have never looked like that. So I wanted, you know, one great ambition was to be a rock star. The other was to play football for Newcastle United. Neither eventualized, but I had a great passion for sport when I was younger. I then actually, curiously, between the ages of about 25 and late 30s, didn't do much sport. And then when I started to come up in politics, I then got back into it again. And I do a lot of sport now. I absolutely love it. And I really do believe that certainly in our case, in countries like mine, without a proper sports policy, you don't have a proper set of policies for the country. And by the way, how can you end up financing your healthcare system for the future unless there's some sense that people will also take responsibility for their own health? So that's one aspect. But the other thing is, I have found one thing in all the time I've been in politics, that you can get the most divided communities in the world. You can get situations of horrible and unbelievable conflict. You can get contexts in which the politicians are completely unable to operate or make sense. But the one thing that can bring people together is sport. And I've seen this in Israel-Palestine. I've seen it in the context of Ireland. I've seen it actually in the context of Rwanda and Sierra Leone and other places, as we've seen from these awards today. And, you know, it's a bit of a sad thing for a politician, but, you know, politicians have limits to what they can do. I think what is fantastic is to see the excitement generated by someone who's well known in sport coming and talking and being with young people. And the fact that you've got successful sportsmen and women today that are prepared to do that, I think is absolutely wonderful. And for me, the whole beyond sport concept is absolutely an idea whose time has come. It's saying sport is fabulous, and look at what more it can achieve beyond sport itself. And that's why I was very, it didn't take me long, as Nick rightly says, to agree to be the chairman of the ambassadors. I've never regretted it. I love doing it, and I will remain as passionate about sport as I am incapable of excelling at it.